For topic 3, we're going to look at fractions with exponents, okay? So if a fraction is in parentheses, and that is fairly important here, so your fraction has to be parentheses, and if it's also raised to a power, the exponent applies to the numerator and denominator. So kind of what I mean by the parentheses. If you have a fraction like a over b in parentheses with an exponent of, say, n, then that exponent of n applies to both the numerator and denominator. Versus if we just had a fraction like this with an exponent of n, in this case, without those parentheses, that exponent of n is really only attached to the numerator, not the denominator. So for what I'm going to show you in example 3, you really do need parentheses with that exponent on the outside. Okay? So for example 3, the directions just say evaluate. So kind of on that note here, when you're evaluating fractions, you're basically just working it out. You're multiplying things out. And remember, when we have exponents, exponents are like shorthand for repeated multiplication. So if I did have something like a over b to the n power, we already know that that exponent of n applies to the numerator and the denominator. So that would just tell me this equals a to the n over b to the n. Okay? So if we look at part A in example 3, we have a fraction in parentheses with an exponent on the outside. So that tells me that exponent of 3, it's going to come into the numerator and the denominator. So that makes this 2 to the third over 3 to the third. Okay? Now, you need to remember that if you have 2 to the third, that's really just the same as 2 times 2 times 2. And if you have 3 to the third, that's really just the same as 3 times 3 times 3. So when we want you to evaluate, we want you to figure out what is 2 to the third, what is 3 to the third. So 2 to the third is 2 times 2, which is 4, times 2 again is 8. And then 3 to the third is 3 times 3, which is 9. And then 9 times 3 again is 27. So 2/3 to the third power is equal to 8/27. Okay? Now, you have to be really, really careful if your base, that's the fraction in this case, if your base is negative. Remember, if you have a negative base, the exponent tells you if the final product is going to be even or odd. So if we have something like this and n is even, we get a positive product. Because that would tell us that we have a positive number of negatives because that negative is getting repeated right along with the base. And if n is even, that tells us we're going to have an even number of negatives. They're all going to pair up and become positive. However, if n is odd, you end up with a negative product because that negative is getting repeated right along with the base. And if you have an odd number as the exponent, you're going to get an odd number of negatives. All but one of those negatives will pair up and become positive, but that one leftover negative makes everything negative. Okay? So looking at part B, we have a situation like this. We have a fraction in parentheses, and it happens to be negative. So we have a negative base. We have an even exponent. That tells me this whole thing is going to be positive. Okay? So we already know this is going to be positive. So when we go to evaluate this out, we just know that that 2 still applies to the 3 and the 5, but we're going to end up with a positive. So this is going to be like 3 squared over 5 squared, everything positive. Now 3 squared is 3 times 3, which is 9. 5 squared is like 5 times 5, which is 25. So we get positive 9/25. Okay? And then finally, for part C, we have to ask ourselves, does the exponent of 2 apply to the 5 and the 9? And in this case, you want to shout to the sky, no, no, it does not, okay? In this case, the 5 only applies to the exponent of 2 only applies to the 5. It does not apply to the 9. So I'm going to put down here just as a note, without parentheses, the exponent of 2 applies only to the numerator, not the denominator. So this is going to be 5 squared, which is 5 times 5. So that's going to be 25. And then the 9 is all by itself. So this is going to be 25/9. So there you have it. That's fractions with exponents. It's not the hardest thing ever. Just make sure as long as your fraction is in parentheses, the exponent on the outside applies to both the numerator and the denominator. Without parentheses, if there's an exponent, it only applies to the part that contains the exponent. And then also don't forget your signs. If you have negative bases, if the negative is inside parentheses, the exponent tells you if you're going to get a positive or a negative product. Even exponent, positive product, negative exponent or negative exponent, even exponent, positive product, odd exponent, negative product.